Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today we're having a look at a legendary piece of photographic equipment. This tiny little thing is a Minox subminiature camera. This became famous during the Second World War and the Cold War as the preferred camera of spies who used it for photographing documents and other intelligence gathering activities. Though, as we'll see, this was never the intended purpose of this particular camera. Now, the Minox was the brainchild of one Walter Zapp, a Baltic German born in 1905 in Riga, the governorate of Livonia, what is now the independent country of Latvia, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire. Now, in 1914, Walter's father, who was the representative of a large manufacturing concern, was declared an enemy alien by the Tsarist government, and he and his family exiled to the Ural Mountains. Now, they would return west in 1921, settling in what was then known as Reval and is today Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. Now, as a result of this rather chaotic childhood, Walter Zapp's schooling was sporadic, and he only ever attained an 8th grade education, though, as we'll see, this had little to no effect on his technical abilities and inventive spirit. Now, as a young man in the 1920s, Zapp first apprenticed as an engraver before becoming a fine art photographer, and it was in this capacity that he met and befriended Nikolai Nylander. And he also became obsessed with the Leica camera, even going so far as to correspond with the camera's inventor, Oskar Barnack. And as a result of this, he and Nylander came up with a concept for an ultra-compact camera that could be carried anywhere and required no special photographic skills to use. And in 1936, the pair went into business, the venture being bankrolled by the financier Rickard Jürgens. Now, Zapp designed and manufactured the first prototype of this camera, which is now known as the Minox, while Nylander came up with the name Minox and designed the company logo, which is intended to look like a mouse in reference to the camera's small size. Now, unfortunately, the trio were not able to find any interest in Estonia, but they did eventually sign a contract with the manufacturing firm Valz Elektrotechnika Fabrika, or VEF, which had a factory in Riga, Zapp's place of birth. And production of the first model Minox, now known as the Riga Minox, began in 1938. Unfortunately, despite being patent protected and marketed in over 18 countries, the Minox never proved as popular as Zapp, Nylander, and Jürgens would have hoped, selling only 17,000 units by 1939. And this is largely due to the high production costs of the camera, as well as the already established popularity and availability of 35mm cameras and accessories. So instead of the ubiquitous everyman's camera that Zapp had envisioned, the Minox instead became largely a luxury gadget for the wealthy. However, as war clouds began gathering in the late 1930s, intelligence agencies around the world recognized the potential of the Minox as a spy camera, which was not only very compact and easy to conceal, but also could focus as close as 8 inches, making it ideal for copying documents. So in the autumn of 1939, the various British intelligence agencies snapped up all the Minox cameras they could get their hands on. And interestingly, in 1940, Lord Brabazon, later Minister of Transport, used a Minox to secretly take at least one photograph of the House of Commons, the first time this had ever been done when the House was in session. Meanwhile, across the pond, the American Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA, had a standing offer of $400 for any Minox camera that could be found. In the end, however, they only managed to get their hands on a couple dozen, and this prompted the development of the Eastman MB camera, also known as Camera X, or the Matchbox camera. Manufactured by Eastman Kodak, as the name suggests, this camera was the same size as an ordinary matchbox, 2 3/8 inches by 1.5 inches by 7/8 inches, and could be issued with Japanese, Swedish, or other labels depending on where the camera and the agent using it was deployed. The camera held 34 exposures of 16mm film, could focus from 4.5 feet to infinity, and had 2 shutter speed settings, 1/75th of a second and a long exposure setting operated by a pneumatic bulb. Also had 2 apertures that was slid into place using a pin, and it was issued with a variety of accessories, including a tripod for copying documents and a compact film developing kit. The Japanese are also known to have produced their own copy, but I digress. Now, the Second World War was a very turbulent time for VEF, with the Riga factory finding itself under Soviet occupation in 1940, under Nazi occupation in 1941, and under Soviet occupation again in 1944. And during this period, all unsold cameras manufactured prior to the occupation had their Made in Latvia markings ground off and replaced with either Made in the Soviet Union or the German Reichsadler. And these cameras were used by the intelligence services of both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and were also given as luxury gifts to SS officers and recipients of the Knight's Cross. Now, Walter Zapp initially refused to return to Germany as part of the repatriation of ethnic Germans to the fatherland, but in 1941, in the face of increasing arrests and imprisonment of perceived enemy aliens, he finally fled Latvia and settled in Berlin, where he spent most of the war working on electron microscopy technology. He also developed something called the Zapp cabinet, which was used by German agents to produce microdots. And these are photo reductions of entire pages of texts or blueprints and things like that, shrunk down to the size of a punctuation mark. And these can be glued onto the punctuation of an ordinary letter or underneath a postage stamp or other innocuous places so that they will hopefully avoid detection by enemy intelligence services. And to learn more about the prehistory of that technology, please check out my previous video on Victorian Stanhope viewers, linked in the description. Now, due to the rather precarious political status of the Riga factory, during the war, Zapp also sought out an alternate site within Germany to continue producing his cameras. And in 1945, the company was reorganized as Minox GmbH, with production resuming in 1948 at a factory in Wetzlar, West Germany. Now, for the curious, GmbH stands for Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung, or Company with Limited Liability, the German equivalent of LLC, and apologies if I massacred that pronunciation. Now, interestingly, a portion of this new post-war production was assembled from parts of cameras discovered by American troops in the Obersalzberg, Hitler and other high Nazi officials' Alpine retreat. And these cameras, presumably presentation items for SS officers, were discovered at the bottom of an elevator shaft. Now, just as before the war, post-war, the Minox largely remained a luxury item and continued to be used by intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. For example, Minox cameras are known to have been used by Pyotr Popov, Oleg Penkovsky, and Dmitry Polyakov, who are all officers in the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, who served as double agents for MI6 and the CIA in the 1950s and 60s. Penkovsky, in particular, gathered intelligence on Soviet ballistic missile capabilities that proved invaluable during the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, he was also betrayed by his Minox, which, while small and easy to conceal, is still very obviously a spy camera and furnished pretty damning evidence when he was finally captured, tried, and executed by the KGB in 1962. And this and other incidents prompted the CIA to develop the even more compact T100 camera, which could be concealed in all sorts of objects, including pens, wristwatches, and lighters. Now, on the flip side of the coin, in 1967, U.S. Navy communications officer John A. Walker, who was suffering from serious financial difficulties, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered his services to the KGB. And over the next 18 years, until he was caught in 1985, he used his status as a military courier to take thousands of classified documents from the U.S. Navy base in Norfolk, Virginia, to his quarters, where he photographed them using a Minox camera. Now, as you can imagine, Minox was quick to capitalize on the association between its product and espionage in a lot of its marketing during this period, much to the chagrin of Walter Zapp, who resented this association. And eventually he and the company parted ways due to irreconcilable differences, though he continued to consult for them from time to time. He would eventually die in 2003 at the age of 97. Now, over the following 60 years, Minox would produce dozens of variations on its basic camera design, some of which we'll go over in a minute. However, by the 1980s, they started facing stiff competition from other sub-miniature cameras, particularly ones manufactured in Japan. And at the end of the century, they underwent a serious reorganization, finally being bought up by the Blazer Group GmbH. Now, the last production Minox camera, the TLX, was discontinued in 2014, while 8x11mm film was discontinued in 2015. Now, the Minox company still exists, but they mainly produce high-quality sporting optics, with their only photographic products being trail cameras. Right, so let's finally have a look at this camera and how it works. Now, perhaps the most distinctive element of the Minox camera, other than its size, is its film advance mechanism, which is operated by telescoping the camera body in and out as so. And this doubles as a protective cover for the lens and the viewfinder when the camera is not in use. Now, the Minox uses a 9.5 millimeter film format that produces 8 by 11 millimeter exposures. And originally, this was produced by cutting unperforated 35 millimeter film in 4, producing strips 8.75 millimeters wide. So just before production of the Riga cameras began in 1938, Walter Zapp changed this to slightly larger 9.5 millimeters. Now, those initial Riga cameras had stainless steel bodies and came with a 15mm f3.5 lens, which could be focused from 8 inches all the way out to infinity. They also had a foil curtain shutter and a parallax compensating viewfinder, though since the image was so small, no diaphragm was fitted to vary the aperture. Now, when production resumed at the Wetzlar factory in 1948, the Minox company released a new version called the Minox A, which replaced the steel body with a plastic one coated in aluminum, which greatly reduced the weight of the camera and also production costs. And this camera came with a new 5-element lens and film gate assembly known as the Pentar. This featured a little glass pressure plate that held the film against the lens before an exposure was taken. And the idea was to improve the quality of images by holding the film flat and in the same plane, but in practice, any dust that got into the mechanism tended to scratch the film when it was advanced through the camera. So about halfway through production in 1950, the Model A's were retrofitted with a new 4-element lens assembly known as the complan or compensating plane, in which the pressure plate actually lifted off of the film before it was advanced through the camera. Now, these retrofitted cameras were designated the Model 3, and the original Model A was retroactively renamed the Model 2. And due to all this retrofitting, Model 2s in their original configuration are pretty rare today. Now, in 1954, Minox introduced the Model 3S, which was just a Model 3 with a flash gun jack or nipple synchronized to the shutter release. And finally, in 1958, we get to the Model B Minox, like this one. And while the Riga Minoxes are considered more collectible, the Model B is widely regarded as the classic mechanical Minox. And indeed, it was the most widely produced, with 384,327 being manufactured between 1958 and 1972. And when this was released, it completely eclipsed the older Model 3S, outselling it by nearly 2 to 1, and forcing Minox to offer a $30 to $40 discount on the Model 3S as a purchase incentive. And the upshot of this is that today you can find plenty of Model Bs for very reasonable prices. In fact, I picked this one up on eBay for only $7. Now, the main reason for this success was that the Model B integrated a semi-automatic exposure system, which we'll look at in a second. But first, let's actually go through the loading and adjustment procedure for this camera step by step. Right, so to open the camera to load the film, you press your fingernail against this little latch on the back, and the body slides open. Now, on this side, you can see the connectors for the flash nipple. And this camera is completely mechanical. It has no batteries or other electronic parts. So this simply acts as a switch to close the circuit in the flash gun, which will have its own battery. Then, of course, in the back, we have the well for our film cartridge. You'll also notice the serial number, and I looked this up, and this camera was manufactured in 1958, making it a very early production Model B. So the film came in little self-contained 2-spool cartridges, the early versions of which held 50 exposures. Later, however, starting with the Model C and BL, these held 15, 30, or 36 exposures. Now, loading and unloading the film is largely a matter of putting in or taking out the cartridge, but in order to do this, you have to open up the film gate, that little pressure plate that holds the film flat against the lens assembly. Otherwise, you risk scratching or tearing the film. And to do this, you simply close the camera body slightly by about 5 millimeters until you feel a slight resistance. Now, once the film is loaded and the camera is closed, we can now move on to the next part of the procedure, which is setting the exposure. Now, as I mentioned, the main selling feature of the Model B was its exposure system. This is based on a selenium photocell, which is housed behind this latticed window on the front. And when light falls on this photocell, it produces a slight electric charge. And when you press down on this button, it connects the photocell to this meter here, moving the needle across the gauge. And then what you do is you turn this dial and align this little arrow with the same line as the needle. And this is known as a match needle system. Now, what this dial does is it adjusts the shutter speed. And as you can see, this goes from half a second all the way down to 1/1000th of a second. There are also two long exposure settings: B for bulb, in which the shutter remains open so long as you keep the shutter release depressed, and then closes as soon as you release it. And then T for time, in which the shutter will open when you press the shutter release once, and then close again when you hit it a second time. And of course, these two settings have to be used with the Minox fixed to a tripod or other solid surface. Now, the other thing you'll notice is this little green dot next to the arrow on the indicator dial, and this is associated with the camera's filter system. So if we take this knurled bar above the lens and move it to the right, we can place either a green or a gray neutral density filter in front of the lens. Now, earlier Minox cameras came with an orange or yellow filter, which was to compensate for the use of tungsten film in a daylight environment in order to increase contrast. And the green filter serves the same purpose, allowing for greater contrast, for example, between foliage and the rest of the scene, or between clouds and the sky. But of course, this filter absorbs quite a bit of light. And so this dot is offset from the main indicator slightly in order to hold the shutter open slightly longer and compensate for this reduced light level. Now, the second gray filter, or neutral density filter, on the other hand, is for use in cases where you're using very high-speed film in a daylight setting, where even the fastest shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second might still lead to overexposure. Now, in addition to placing a filter over the lens, this setting also resets the light meter so you can still use the regular range of shutter speeds even in these extreme conditions. And finally, on the opposite side of the dial, you'll see numbers labeled ASA. And this is in reference to the American Standards Association system for film speed. And this allows you to preset the camera depending on what type of film you are loading into it. Now, two last notes on the exposure system before we move on. Early versions of the Minox B had the photocell behind a latticed window like this one, while in 1966 this was changed to a honeycomb pattern. Also, these selenium photocells tend to degrade with time and exposure to light, meaning that a lot of the ones still in existence no longer work. And this seems to be the case with this particular example. Even if I shine a very bright light at the cell and push down on the exposure button, the needle doesn't move. Right, so moving on, this kidney-shaped window is the exposure counter, and this is designed for use with the older 50 exposure cartridges, so that once you finish a cartridge, the counter will automatically reset to 0. However, if you use this with the later 15, 30, or 36 exposure cartridges, you need to cycle the film advance a couple of times in order to reset the counter. Now, earlier versions of the Minox would advance the film whether you hit the shutter release or not, but from the model BL forward, the cameras featured a so-called freewheeling system where the film wouldn't advance no matter how many times you cycle the body until you actually hit the shutter release, and this helped to eliminate wasted exposures. And finally, we get to our last control, which is our focus knob. Now, the lens on this can focus down to as close as 8 inches, which is why it was so popular for photographing documents. However, these cameras, as I said before, were intended for use as casual snapshot cameras, and so the optimal range on these is set at 12 feet, marked here as a red dot between the 6-foot mark and infinity. And you'll notice that the index has what we might call error bars or a range on either side. And this is because the depth of field extended quite a few feet in front and behind the focal plane, and so you really didn't have to be very precise when setting the focus at that distance. However, the closer you focused, the shallower the depth of field became. And this is why Minox cameras came with this accessory, a measuring chain, which attaches the camera by pressing it into this little gate on the side and twisting it 90 degrees. And the chain is marked at 8 inches, 10 inches, 12 inches, and 18 inches, just like on the focusing dial. And this allowed you to very precisely measure the distance to whatever subject you were trying to photograph. And as you can see, the chain also attaches to the carrying case, acting as a retaining lanyard to prevent you from accidentally dropping the camera. And that is how the Minox Model B operates. Now, as I've stated before, these videos are intended to be technical overviews and not collector's guides, so I won't go over every single model and minor variation that Minox produced between 1948 and 2015. However, I can cover some of the major developments to the camera's design. So, for example, in 1969, Minox released the Model C, which was the largest subminiature camera that they produced and the first to feature an automatic exposure system and electronic shutter, both of which were powered by a 5.6-volt mercury cell battery. It also featured a slow-speed signal light that indicated if the shutter speed needed to photograph a certain scene was below 1/30th of a second. That is, the camera needed to be used with a tripod. And in 1972, the Model B was retrofitted with a cadmium sulfide-based exposure meter to become the Model BL. While this exposure meter was more sensitive and reliable than the earlier selenium models, it worked via variable resistance rather than the photoelectric effect, and thus required a button cell battery to power it. Otherwise, the camera was fully mechanical, with the only other design changes being the elimination of the green filter and the moving of the ASA speed film dial to the bottom of the camera. And the LX, introduced in 1976, replaced the cadmium sulfide photocell with a silicon blue cell, or SBC. Now, the next model in the series, the EC, was released in 1981 and was a radical departure from previous models, having a body made completely out of fiber-reinforced plastic, a fixed focus lens, and a proprietary adapter that allowed the camera to be used with flash cubes. Now, the AX, introduced in 1992, was a limited edition combining features of the BL and the LX, and was produced in small numbers with luxury finishes, including the gold Walter Zapp signature model, 250 of which were produced in 1995 to celebrate 100 years of Minox as a German company. Now, other special finishes that Minoxes were produced in include chrome, sterling silver, platinum, titanium, and black anodized private eye editions. In 1974, Minox also introduced a series of 35mm and 110 film format cameras, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this particular video. Now, as you can imagine, Minoxes came with a whole bunch of accessories, including tripods, copying stands, portable development tanks, and even an adapter that allowed a pair of binoculars to be used as a telephoto lens. However, those are an entire subject unto themselves, and I will save those for a future video, so please stay tuned for that. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and a big shout out to Julian Horn, who once again provided invaluable assistance on the research for this video. I'll see you next time on another video or look at yet more cameras and other fascinating devices just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.